You know, it's funny, being the daughter of a comedian, I am not funny at all. My name is Michele Gregory. My father, Dick Gregory, he was the first black comedian in this country who performed at all-white nightclubs.
I also found out that comedy is the hardest job in the world today. People are so worried about world problems. Everybody likes to talk to the comedian. You know, in my traveling, if I could believe everything people told me, we wouldn't have a racial problem in this country.
That's really how he got his start as a comedian, where he had moved out of performing at exclusively black clubs. You know, the clubs were segregated in the 1960s. As children, we didn't really know that our father was famous until perhaps we were in our teenage years. In the late 1960s, my father, my mother, my sister Lynn, who was about 7, myself, I was 9, we went to the Ed Sullivan Show in New York City. We lived in Chicago at the time. And it was kind of a big deal. We knew who Ed Sullivan was. Kind of was the first time that I got a sense of, wow, my dad must be kind of famous. For my father, the issue of civil rights was infused in his comedy.
Negroes in Chicago move into one large area and it looked like we might control the votes. They don't say anything to us. They have a slum clearance.
So in the 1960s, the #1 show on television was the Jack Paar Show. And if you were able to get on the Jack Paar Show, you had made it. But my dad had pointed out that one of the issues for black artists is that they could come and sing and dance, but they were never allowed to sit on his sofa. My dad, actually, when he got the call from Jack Paar to perform on his show, he said, well, only if I can sit on the sofa. And that was about acknowledgement and respect. And my dad became the first black entertainer to be on the Jack Paar Show that could sit down on the sofa. And that opened up the door for every other black entertainer that came after him. I think about someone like my father, even though there were years growing up where we saw him maybe 30 days in an entire year. A day here, 2 days there, half a day here. There were some years where maybe we saw him maybe 60 days broken up. Essentially, there was certainly a physical absence. And yet at the same time, my father was still always very present. It was the lessons that he attempted to bestow upon us of what was important, especially as he started to become really famous. My parents didn't tolerate arrogance. They didn't tolerate us going around telling people who our father was. And for my father, I remember, you know, up until some years ago, he'd always talk about the importance of what type of human being are you? How do you treat other people? You can't have the sort of life my father had without being married to a particular type of person. My parents are married for 58 years, and my mother is the bedrock, in many ways, of our family. My mother has a very different sense of humor than my father. Of my 10 siblings, 9 of us have college degrees, some of us advanced degrees. That doesn't happen unless there's a lot of structure. In terms of my dad, you know, his comedy, he never became mainstream, but at some point mainstream took an interest in him. That was the cue for him to make this about civil rights, his comedy. In the 70s, he decided to stop comedy because he just felt civil rights was that much more important, certainly to him. There was too much real life, too much notice that he wanted to bring attention to. For him to say, I can only just be funny. I can't just be funny. I have to tie this into real world events, oppression, inequality. And to that end, that was till the day he died. That's what that man did. He was so adamant that we would educate our mind. He always tried to understand what was important to people, what made them tick, what made them happy. Whether in his comedy routines or civil rights, he talked endlessly about power. I remember he often said that what made Martin Luther King Jr. so important was that he was the first African American that influenced public policy in this country.
The greatness of America is the right to protest far right.
So as a professor of sociology at York College who works in the Department of Behavioral Sciences, which looks at behavior and social sciences, the issue of power is paramount. Whether we're examining people, whether they're politicians, executives, and questioning this term hegemony. Why are so many executives, so many politicians, white upper class men? I mean, although those numbers are changing a little bit, especially after the last presidential election, they change very slowly. And power, it's crucial. Power is also, to me, a factor of symbolic value. And when I think about power embodies the people who inhabit these powerful positions. There's not one way in which power operates, certainly. Working at a college like your college, especially in the CUNY system, many of our students are working class. Many of them are Latinx, Asian, African American immigrants. So folks who are not always identified as having power. Certainly for many of my students, they really appreciate discussions about this. Because at the end of the day, for many of those who work now or hope to have different types of jobs in the future, whether they see themselves as one day being able to hold those positions of power and how they would behave and act differently. When I think about my students and all kind of barriers, levels of inequality, and when I think about certainly the lessons that my father has given me, and one key lesson is rigorous analysis, talking about gender, race, sexuality, disability. That runs through so many themes of my research. And although I wasn't always conscious of it relative to my dad, today I certainly am, absolutely. There may be this position that society is in now where more people are speaking up about certain types of comedy that they don't like. But the reality is that people always spoke up about comedy that they didn't like. The difference now, of course, is with social media, this kind of goes around the world. But comedians, many times, are always heckled about the material that they used. You know, when I think about the connection between humor and power, I mean, if we just look even outside of my father, I mean, look at some of the most important comedians. You know, just the notoriety, the way they can open doors. There's a range of emotions entertainers can invoke in other people. But it is something at the core about when we laugh, inhibitions sometimes move away. And with that, the opportunity to have maybe meaningful discussion. The world doesn't change overnight. As I tell my students, we've had 400 years of a racial hierarchy in this country. The last 55 years, it's been remarkable change. And I'm happy to say my father has been a part of that. But you can't ignore those 400 years. I don't think humor and comedy in and of itself is always the answer. It's part of a narrative, it's part of a form of communication that can help move us, I hope, to a better place. You know, in terms of myself and my identity and power, and I do definitely believe that since my father passed away, I have thought about that, you know, a bit more than I had before, you know, just kind of wanting to make sure I do right by my father. So when I look in the mirror and sort of look at this reflection, it's always been about my parents. The ability to make people laugh. And I just think about, you know, all the years, all the times I've gone and seen my father perform. And you can really forget the material and just look at the people. If we think about, you know, of all the forms of expression, the ability to laugh and be around people who make you laugh, it is priceless.